I want to thank you all for having me today. As Alyssa said, my name is Bryson and I'm a bisexual trans man. I use he, him pronouns. I'll be talking today about inequality as it relates to trans people, some of my experiences in transitioning and navigating changing gender roles. Before we get started, I'll just define a few terms. Trans is short for transgender. This means identifying as a gender other than the one you're assumed to be at birth or assigned at birth is generally what we say. This covers a huge number of identities and experiences beyond just trans men and trans women. Cis is short for cisgender, and it means you identify as a gender you were assigned at birth. It essentially just means not trans. Where trans means across, cis means on the same side of. So congrats, you now know a bit of Latin. Transmasculine refers to people who are assigned female at birth, but who see themselves as on the masculine side of the gender spectrum, but not necessarily as completely male. The equivalent for people assigned male at birth is transfeminine. Non-binary is a term that covers many different identities and experiences. In the broadest sense, it refers to people who see themselves as existing outside of the gender binary in some way. That is, outside the idea that only men and women exist. Non-binary people may see themselves as outside of this entirely, as a combination of male and female, or masculine and feminine, or as moving between the two. Or it might be more to do with presentation and presenting yourself in a way that isn't strictly male or female. It's a very personal thing and it means something different for everyone. Binary, as you might guess, refers to trans people who see themselves as existing within the gender binary. I'll be talking a little bit more about what this means for me specifically later on. Heteronormative refers to heteronormativity, which is the idea that to be heterosexual or to behave in ways expected of heterosexual people is the norm and the most desired way to be. Passing is in the context of trans issues, means that someone passes as a cis person of the gender they identify as, i.e. you can't tell that they're trans. So for example, you might think that I pass really well because generally people don't realize that I'm trans unless I tell them. This has all sorts of issues when it's held up as the most desirable way for a trans person to exist. Some trans people can't pass for whatever reason, and some don't want to. The idea that being visibly trans is a bad thing then puts being cis as the best way to be, which obviously undermines and degrades trans people, their experiences and identities. As well as this, the expectation that trans people have to pass can also be dangerous, especially for trans women, who are particularly at risk of physical harm just by existing in the world. Of course, there's so much to say on this topic, and I'll only be able to cover a very small amount. Please let me know if anything I said could be explained better, especially you, Alyssa. I'll be answering some questions afterwards, and I encourage you all to keep engaging with this topic, especially since it's becoming more and more talked about. Plus, trans people who are supported have much better mental health outcomes. This is especially important as trans people experience disproportionately high levels of mental illness and suicide rates. I've been made aware that there are some trans students in this course, and I want to say to all of you, but to them especially, that of course I don't speak for all trans people. Trans experiences are incredibly complex and diverse, and are affected by factors like socioeconomic background, culture, family support, the gender you're assigned at birth, the gender you identify as, whether you're non-binary, the list goes on. As a white, cis-passing, binary-identified trans man whose transition has been relatively smooth, I have incredible privilege. This talk will look very different if given by a trans woman of colour, for example, so it's important to keep that in mind. That said, I feel like at least some of what I say will be relevant to most trans people existing within a Western context. The barriers and attitudes we face are informed by broader societal norms and concepts, which affect us all, as to some of the discriminatory laws I'll be talking about. First off, I'll be discussing how I felt as my relationship to gender and my role in society changed. As you've heard, men and women have long been expected to have specific roles in society. Although these are broadening and changing, it's still the case that there are sets of behaviours and expectations typically associated with men and women. Experiencing both sides has been interesting, challenging, and freeing. During transition, I thought a lot about gender, what it means to me, how I want to do it, and how it relates to society more broadly. Something that's been both difficult and liberating has been the realisation that I'm a binary trans man. This, to me, means that my gender expression and my goals for gender expression line up very much with society's idea of binary masculinity, i.e. cis heteronormative masculinity. In realising this, I felt somewhat of a loss, even though it was affirming to understand myself in this way. You see, before I realised I was trans, I took great pleasure in bucking the system, so to speak. I was very gender non-conforming, and I saw that as integral to my queer identity. Once I understood myself as male and began publicly identifying as such, the way I dressed, had my hair, and generally presented was no longer an act of rebellion in the eyes of society, but expected and normal. I was extremely relieved and happy to take this step. At the same time, I felt that in finding myself, I had lost a part of my queerness. Of course, gender identity and sexuality are not the same, although many people visibly express their queerness through gender non-conformity. This no longer felt right for me. As well, the community of queer women that I once felt a part of was no longer mine. I've heard other trans men and trans masculine people express similar sentiments. In a society that is still so divided by gender or perceived gender, moving across or between lines means that you have to relearn your place in the world. Spaces that were once open to you are no longer open to you. And spaces that were once forbidden are suddenly yours to occupy. I still feel weird going into the men's bathroom sometimes, although that might be the smell. I'm 28 and I began transitioning when I was 22. Suddenly, after 22 years, I found myself as one of the boys, something I desperately wanted but had no idea how to navigate. I hadn't learned how to be a boy growing up, so I had to learn a lot and fast. I learned that hugging and touchy-feely stuff was a lot less acceptable. I learned that I had to be careful being openly expressive to women and children, lest I seem creepy. A friend pulled me aside early on in my transition and pointed out that in our group of mainly female friends, jokes that I made previously had a different flavour and now meant that I came across as sexist. That was a hard thing to learn because, of course, I didn't want to hurt my friends or be seen as a dickhead. It's been a whole new world of learning to watch my language, how I take up space, all that kind of stuff. Less important socially, but still important personally, I've had to learn things like how to buy clothes that fit, what haircut to ask for, how to shave, and how to pee standing up. I got in trouble once for drunkenly announcing this last achievement to a group of friends at a pub. Of course, these are not things that automatically make someone a man. I know trans guys and trans masculine people who like to wear dresses and makeup, who don't pee standing up, who have long hair. I also know cis guys who do these things. In other words, they express themselves in ways that are not expected of them as men or masculine people, but they still see themselves as such. This is the difference between gender identity and gender expression. People whose gender expression differs from what's expected of them are often subjected to discrimination and harassment. This is even more the case for trans people who don't pass, or whose gender expression might deliberately be something other than typically masculine or feminine. For example, trans guys who enjoy things like makeup are accused of not being really trans, including and sometimes especially by other trans people, which is really sad. As well as navigating changing gender roles, then, trans people also have to navigate attitudinal barriers as well as systemic barriers. which means that trans people experience a lot of inequality. This inequality happens in almost all areas of our lives, and I'll be discussing a few below, as well as some examples. You just saw that trans people have a disproportionately high unemployment rate. This has flow-on effects, such as making it harder to afford medical transition for those who want it, to find housing, and therefore to break away from unsupported family. I've heard countless stories of people who've had to continue living in crappy situations because they're unable to afford to move out. Personally, I've never experienced direct discrimination in employment due to the fact that I'm able to pass. I'm very lucky in this. What it does mean is that I have to hide a huge part of myself in a work situation unless I know it's explicitly queer friendly. This can be exhausting. Although I don't want to go around wearing a t-shirt that says, "Hey, I'm trans," it would be nice to be able to be open if I should choose to be. I've also experienced a lack of understanding from my employment providers about the very real anxiety I feel about finding a trans-friendly workplace. Once, one of them said to me, "Well, it shouldn't matter." And yeah, it shouldn't matter, but it does, because otherwise the statistics would be better, right? My experience is nothing compared to the direct discrimination experienced by some other trans people. At a previous tutoring job, I asked my boss if a friend of mine, a trans woman, could have some work with her. My boss asked some of the parents we worked with, who said they wouldn't be comfortable with my friend working with their kids. This is a small and pretty benign example of discrimination. I know of other people who have directly experienced transphobic harassment in their place of work and who have feared losing their job after coming out. Another area where trans people experience inequality and barriers is in the context of medical and legal transition. Although it's catching up, the medical field still has a long way to go in providing consistent, good care for trans people. Personally, I've found that I often have to educate my doctors on trans issues, even those who previously worked with trans people. This is an experience shared by many of us and can make going to the doctor an incredibly nerve-wracking and difficult experience. Even where trans-competent doctors exist, there are barriers to accessing them, such as distance, cost, and waiting time. In addition, there are attitudinal barriers within the medical community that trans people have to overcome. As I said previously, as I've transitioned, my feelings about my gender have evolved. When I first came out, I identified as non-binary, meaning I didn't fully see myself as male. I wasn't sure what I wanted my transition to look like, or even if I wanted to medically transition. I've noticed that people are surprised when I tell them this, as though I should have just known exactly what I wanted from the very beginning. The most difficult is when I hear this response from doctors. One was surprised that all my mental health issues hadn't been automatically cured by me transitioning. In accessing medical treatment, trans people are held to an absolute standard of surety constantly. We are constantly asked to prove ourselves and justify our existence. It is still often the case that in order to access each step of medical transition, trans people have to be assessed by a psychiatrist. I've heard it said by others that there's no other medical procedure that requires such a level of proof. As well, going to psychiatrist appointments can be very expensive, and as we already know, trans people are less likely to have financial means to do so. Difficulties in accessing medical transition then mean that legally, trans people face yet more barriers. In New South Wales, a person has to have had surgery on their reproductive organs in order to change the gender on their birth certificate. This surgery isn't something that all trans people want or can access, so it is grossly unfair that they're required to do so if they want documentation that reflects their gender. In addition, it's invasive and also means that a person won't be able to have their own biological children. It's an awful thing to have to choose between having children and having documents that reflect who you are. As you can imagine, not having correct documents has flow-on effects in employment and housing situations. I know for me, I used to feel anxious every time I was in a situation where I had to give my legal name and gender. There is a constant sense of trepidation when you exist as a trans person, even if you're not experiencing direct discrimination. I was able to change my gender relatively easily as I was born in Canberra, All I needed was my doctor to sign a form, and that was it. Why should it be the case that my friends who were born here have to undergo such an arduous and difficult procedure, whereas I didn't, simply because of where we were born? So, as you can see, there are so many inequalities that exist for trans people, and many more that I haven't even touched on, especially for non-binary people, for whom things are further behind still. The law is still very binary and refers to transitioning to the opposite gender, which obviously excludes non-binary people. I believe that discrimination against trans people comes from the fact that we challenge the status quo. Our existence goes against the idea of firmly cemented categories and roles for men and women. As we know, cis people who do this are also discriminated against and harassed, and trans people take that challenging the status quo, to a whole new level. Although things are changing and have changed even since I began to transition, there is still a long way to go in addressing the barriers and inequalities that trans people face. The good news is, the more you learn, the more you can go out and be a part of that change. Even just having a conversation with someone can make a difference. Thank you so much, and I hope you've enjoyed this and learned something from it. And thank you very much to Alyssa for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Does anyone have any questions? Thank you. I think you've done a fair...
There's a question there.
With the pressure to get the different surgeries in order to fit in with changing sex, do you think that there is still a large pressure and stigma that stays in the LGBT community as well against surgeries, or is that something that's kind of purely pressured from outside the community?
Do you mean like even within the community, are we expected to have surgeries?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So like if I'm talking to, people, often like even in a queer context, often like one of the first questions I'll ask them when they find out I'm trans is like, have you had the surgery yet? So unfortunately the ignorance is not like restricted to the wider community. Particularly in the case of like, if you're gay or bi as a trans man, or as a trans woman, I guess, like, yeah, there's a lot of like focus on genitals and genital reconstruction. So yeah. And unfortunately an attitude in like the gay male community is like, ooh, I never touch a vagina, which is like really sad if you're a trans guy who hasn't had surgery or who doesn't want surgery. It can be very disheartening.
Okay.
That was a great question.
It
Any
was.
other questions?
Thank you.